Don't trust the DNA report, the little girl whispered, her voice so soft it barely cut through the sterile hum of the glass-walled boardroom. Yet it was enough to make every conversation die at once. The city skyline of Chicago pressed against the towering windows of Whitmore Genetics Tower, where sunlight reflected off polished steel tables and illuminated a room full of people who suddenly didn't know where to look. At the center of it all stood Ethan Whitmore, 42 years old, a billionaire biotech entrepreneur whose name had become synonymous with precision, innovation, and control. He slowly turned his head toward the small figure beside him, a girl no taller than the edge of the conference table, her hands clenched tightly around the strap of an old backpack. "What did you just say?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but sharpened by confusion. The girl swallowed, her eyes steady despite the weight of every adult gaze pressing down on her. "I said it's not real," she repeated, a little clearer this time, pointing toward the massive screen displaying a sealed genetic report labeled Confirmed Paternity, matched 99.98%. A quiet ripple moved through the room, the kind of unease that comes when certainty is challenged by something it cannot immediately explain. On Ethan's right, Dr. Victoria Hale, the company's lead genetic consultant, and his fiancée, let out a small, controlled laugh. She adjusted her silver bracelet and tilted her head slightly, as if the child were speaking a language too simple to be taken seriously. "Ethan," she said gently, "she's just a child. She doesn't understand what she's looking at." But the girl didn't move back. Her name was Aaliyah Johnson, 8 years old, with deep brown eyes that didn't wander, didn't break, didn't apologize for existing in a room that clearly didn't expect her to be there. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing between the report and the child. "Aaliyah," he said carefully, "this test was processed through 3 independent labs. It's verified." Aaliyah shook her head once. "Not that one," she whispered again, and that single phrase landed heavier than anything else said in the room. The air shifted. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean, not that one?" Before she could answer, Victoria stepped slightly forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Ethan, we shouldn't entertain this. The results are certified. There's no scenario where there is," Aaliyah interrupted, her voice still quiet but suddenly firm in a way that made even Victoria pause mid-sentence. She reached into her backpack with slow, deliberate movements, pulling out a folded piece of paper and a small encrypted USB drive. She placed them on the table between them like evidence too fragile to touch. Ethan's eyes dropped to them instinctively. "I took it from the secondary lab archive," she said. "The one nobody checks twice." A murmur passed through the room, executives shifting in their seats, security personnel exchanging uncertain glances. Victoria's smile tightened, but her eyes flickered for the first time. "That's impossible," she said softly, though her tone had lost its earlier confidence. Aaliyah slid the paper forward. "Then explain why the raw sequence data doesn't match the final report." Silence hit the room like a sealed door closing. Ethan didn't move. His gaze locked onto the numbers printed on the page, scanning, recalculating, something inside him resisting the implication before it fully formed. Victoria let out a controlled breath and forced a smile. "Ethan, these are technical anomalies. Noise in raw data happens all the time. It doesn't mean anything was changed." Aaliyah looked up at her directly now. "It wasn't noise," she said. "It was edited." The word hung there, too precise to dismiss easily. Ethan finally looked at her fully, really looked at her, as if seeing her not as a child, but as a question he hadn't realized was already inside his life. "Why would anyone do that?" he asked quietly. Aaliyah hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before answering. "Because the truth would change everything you think you own." The room seemed to shrink with that sentence. Victoria's fingers tightened slightly around her bracelet, but her expression remained composed. "This is ridiculous," she said, though the edge in her voice was sharper now. "Ethan, you can't let this disrupt. Stop," Ethan said suddenly, not loudly, but with a quiet authority that cut through her words instantly. He didn't take his eyes off Aaliyah. "Show me." Aaliyah nodded once and pressed the USB drive into the central terminal. The screen flickered, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then lines of raw genetic code filled the display, shifting, aligning, and then diverging sharply from the official report still projected beside it. A subtle change passed through Ethan's face, first confusion, then concentration, then something colder, deeper. Victoria stepped closer, her voice lowering. Ethan, this doesn't mean what she thinks it means. But he wasn't listening to her anymore. His eyes were fixed on a single discrepancy line repeating across multiple sequences, a pattern that should not exist unless someone had deliberately altered the dataset after verification. Slowly, Ethan stepped back from the table. The room was completely silent now, every person frozen in the realization that something foundational had just cracked open. Aaliyah didn't look away from him. I didn't want to tell you like this, she said softly, but you were never supposed to see the real file. Ethan's voice came out lower than before. Who are you? For the first time, Aaliyah hesitated. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she did. And somewhere deep inside the sterile glass walls of Whitmore Genetics Tower, the truth had already begun to shift everything it touched. The silence in the glass conference room did not break immediately. It stretched, fragile and suffocating, as if even the air conditioning system had paused to listen. Ethan Whitmore remained standing at the head of the table, his eyes still locked on the shifting genetic data frozen on the screen. Around him, executives avoided eye contact, their earlier confidence replaced by the uneasy stillness of people who had just witnessed something they could not categorize. Dr. Victoria Hale was the first to move. She stepped closer to the table, her movements controlled, precise, but there was a subtle tension in her jaw that betrayed her composure. Ethan, she said softly, her voice now carefully measured. This is exactly why raw data should never be interpreted outside of controlled review environments. You are looking at fragments without context. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted slowly from the screen to her face, studying her in a way he had not before. Then give me the context, he said finally, his voice low and steady. Aaliyah stood beside the table, her small hand still resting near the USB drive, as if she was afraid someone might take it away if she looked away for even a second. Victoria offered a faint smile, the kind designed to restore order rather than express warmth. The context is simple. Children are not part of this process. Genetic verification is handled through multiple validation layers. What she is presenting could easily be a misinterpretation of cache data or an unauthorized access artifact. Aaliyah shook her head slightly, not interrupting, but clearly resisting the dismissal. Ethan noticed that. He noticed it more than anything else. The certainty in her silence did not feel like confusion. It felt like conviction. Where did you get access to this? Ethan asked her, turning slightly. Aaliyah hesitated just long enough to show that the question mattered. I wasn't supposed to, she said quietly. But I heard them talking in the lower lab corridor 2 nights ago. They said the final report had been corrected before it ever reached your system. A faint shift passed through the room again, subtle but noticeable. One of the senior analysts lowered his eyes to his tablet, suddenly very interested in something that was not happening in the room. Victoria exhaled gently, as if indulging a child's imagination. Ethan, this is exactly why we restrict access. She is repeating overheard fragments without understanding technical meaning. Ethan raised his hand slightly, not to silence Aaliyah, but to stop Victoria. The gesture was quiet, but final enough that she did not continue speaking. He looked back at Aaliyah. Corrected by who? Aaliyah's eyes flicked briefly toward Victoria before returning to Ethan. I saw her name on the access log, she said. Dr. Victoria Hale. The air changed again, but this time it was not subtle. It tightened. Ethan did not react immediately. His expression remained controlled, but something inside his gaze began to shift, like a system recalibrating after receiving unexpected input. Victoria let out a soft, almost amused breath. That is absurd. Access logs are secure. There is no scenario in which a child could properly interpret encrypted audit trails. Then explain this, Aaliyah said, pushing the printed sheet forward again. The timestamps do not match the official submission window. Someone accessed the file after certification and altered the output sequence. Ethan picked up the sheet this time. His fingers moved slowly, carefully, as if the paper itself had become heavier. He scanned the lines again, but this time he was not reading as a businessman or even as a scientist. He was reading as someone trying to determine whether the foundation he had built his entire life on was still intact. Victoria stepped closer to him now, her voice lowering, becoming more intimate. more persuasive. Ethan, you are exhausted. This entire acquisition deal has been under pressure for weeks. You are seeing patterns where there are none because you are being pulled in too many directions. Ethan did not look at her. I am seeing repetition in data that should be random, he said quietly. That is not stress. That is manipulation. A flicker crossed Victoria's face, gone almost instantly, but Aaliyah saw it. Ethan saw it too. A long moment passed where no one spoke. Even the executives around the table seemed to understand that they were no longer participants in a meeting, but witnesses to something unfolding beyond their control. Ethan finally set the paper down. Lock the room, he said calmly. A security officer hesitated. Sir, lock it, Ethan repeated, his voice sharper now. The doors clicked quietly as internal protocols engaged. Victoria's posture changed almost imperceptibly. She turned slightly toward Ethan. What exactly are you suggesting? She asked, her tone still controlled, but now edged with something colder. Ethan looked at her directly. I am suggesting that someone inside this building altered genetic identity. Records after certification. Aaliyah looked up at him then, and for the first time, there was something like relief in her expression. Not because she had been believed completely, but because she had not been dismissed. Victoria gave a small, disbelieving smile. And you are taking the word of a child over verified systems and professional oversight. Ethan paused. The silence that followed was not uncertainty. It was calculation. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. I am taking the evidence seriously, no matter where it came from. Aaliyah's grip on her backpack strap loosened slightly. Outside the glass walls, the city continued moving as if nothing had changed. But inside the room, something irreversible had already begun to shift. And Victoria Hale, standing too still in the center of it, understood that control was no longer something she could assume. The lock on the conference room door clicked into place with a soft mechanical finality, and the sound alone seemed to compress the atmosphere even further. Inside the glass walls of Whitmore Genetics Tower, the city of Chicago moved on in distant motion blur, cars like scattered lights far below, while inside, every person remained frozen in a quiet tension that no one had officially named yet. Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of it, his attention no longer divided, his focus narrowing as if the world had reduced itself to only what could be proven. Aaliyah Johnson remained close to the table, her small frame steady but alert, watching Ethan more than anything else now. Dr. Victoria Hale had not moved from her position near the display screen, but her posture had changed subtly, less relaxed, more controlled, as though she was calculating not data but outcomes. Ethan broke the silence first. I want a full audit of every genetic file processed under Project Helix in the last 6 months, he said calmly. His voice carried authority, but it also carried something new. Uncertainty sharpened into action. A senior analyst hesitated. Sir, that would require executive override clearance and could trigger regulatory notifications. Ethan did not look at him. Then initiate executive override. A brief pause followed. Then the system confirmed compliance. A soft hum filled the room as multiple screens shifted from static reports into live audit protocols. Rows of encrypted metadata began to scroll across the display, timestamps, access logs, modification entries, all becoming visible layer by layer like a structure being peeled open. Aaliyah stepped closer to the table, pointing carefully. That one, she said. Ethan followed her finger. A single file entry was highlighted in pale blue. Genetic Sequence Report Whitmore Family Line Certified Final Version. Ethan frowned slightly. That is the same report, he said. Aaliyah shook her head immediately. Look again at the modification history. Victoria interjected quickly, her voice smooth but firmer now. Modification histories are standard in iterative lab environments. They do not indicate malicious intent. Open it, Ethan said. The command was directed at no one in particular, but everyone reacted. The file expanded. A second layer appeared beneath the certified report. Ethan leaned in slightly. Aaliyah remained silent now, watching his reaction more than the screen itself. The modification log displayed a single unauthorized entry, timestamped at 2:43 in the morning 3 days before certification. Access origin, internal secure terminal, genetic oversight division. User ID, VH_72. Ethan did not speak immediately. He simply stared at the line. Victoria exhaled softly. That is a system glitch, she said quickly. User IDs can be duplicated in sandbox environments. You know that. Ethan finally turned his head toward her. His expression was no longer confused. It was measured. That ID is assigned to your terminal access profile, he said. Victoria's smile tightened slightly. Then it is a formatting error. Aaliyah spoke again, quietly but clearly. There is more. Ethan looked back at the screen. She reached forward and tapped the secondary file. A new layer opened, revealing raw sequence adjustments. Certain markers had been shifted, not randomly, but in a structured pattern that altered identity probability scoring. Ethan's breathing slowed as he processed it. This is not noise, he said softly. This is targeted adjustment. Victoria stepped closer now, her voice lowering. Ethan, you are interpreting technical variance as intent because you are under pressure. That is not how these systems function. Ethan finally looked at her fully. Then explain why every alteration aligns with a single outcome, he said. The room did not move. Even the air seemed still. Aaliyah looked up at him. Because someone wanted the result to change, she said. A long silence followed. Ethan turned back to the data. Each modification was now clearly visible, layered like a deliberate rewrite of biological truth. He scrolled further down. Another entry appeared. Final override confirmation. Signed. Authorized lock. The signature line was encrypted, but partially decrypted through the audit system. Ethan read it once, then again. His face changed subtly, not in shock, but in realization that arrived too precisely to ignore. Victoria stepped forward quickly. Ethan, stop. You are misreading technical artifacts. This is what happens when non-specialists interpret raw system logs. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he closed the file and reopened it through a secure mirror interface, bypassing the standard display. The same entries appeared again, unchanged. His voice when it came was quieter than before. This system does not produce identical artifacts under independent verification unless the data is real. Victoria's eyes flickered for the first time, just slightly. Aaliyah took a small step closer to Ethan. I did not want to show you like this, she said. But they were going to finalize everything without you ever seeing it. Ethan looked down at her. For a brief moment, the room felt less like a corporate environment and more like a suspended truth between three people. Why would anyone alter my genetic records? He asked, not loudly, but with a weight that filled the space. Aaliyah hesitated. Because if the original match had stayed, you would have known the truth about who I am, she said. Victoria spoke immediately. This is speculation influenced by emotional bias. But Ethan did not look at her this time. He was still looking at Aaliyah. What truth? He asked quietly. Aaliyah's voice softened. That I was never supposed to be removed from the system. The words settled into the room without resistance, as if they had been waiting there longer than anyone else. Ethan stepped back slightly, his hand resting on the edge of the table for balance, not physical, but conceptual. Everything he had believed about the report, about confirmation, about finality, was now layered with something unstable beneath it. Victoria watched him carefully now, her control still intact, but no longer effortless. Ethan, she said gently, you need to step away from this before you make conclusions that cannot be undone. Ethan finally looked at her again. His voice was calm, but no longer passive. It is already undone, he said. The atmosphere inside the glass conference room had changed in a way that was no longer subtle. It was no longer just tension or uncertainty. It was structure collapsing quietly under its own weight. Ethan Whitmore stood near the center of the table, his eyes no longer fixed on any single screen, but on the invisible pattern that had begun forming in his mind. Aaliyah Johnson remained close to him, her presence steady, almost anchored, as if she had been holding this moment together longer than anyone realized. Dr. Victoria Hale had not moved far, but her distance now felt strategic rather than casual. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm, but no longer uncertain. If these modifications are real, they did not happen by accident. Victoria responded immediately, her tone controlled but sharpened. You are still assuming intent where there may only be system instability. Large-scale genetic processing environments produce irregularities under load. Ethan turned slightly toward her. Not in a sealed certification pipeline, he said. A brief silence followed. Aaliyah looked up at Ethan. They did not just change one report, she said quietly. They changed the pathway that led to it. Ethan's brow tightened. What do you mean? Aaliyah stepped closer to the screen and pointed at a sequence of timestamps. Every time the data was verified, it was redirected through a secondary validation. Note: that node does not exist in your public system map. One of the senior engineers leaned forward, squinting. That is not possible. All validation nodes are registered. Aaliyah shook her head. Not if someone built a hidden mirror layer. The room went still again. Ethan stared at the data, his mind moving rapidly now, not reacting emotionally, but reconstructing structure. Victoria's expression remained composed, but her hands had shifted slightly, fingers interlacing more tightly than before. Ethan, she said carefully, even if there were anomalies, the conclusion you are approaching would require coordinated access across multiple secured divisions. That level of breach would be immediately detected. Ethan did not look at her when he answered. Unless the detection system itself was part of the structure being used. That sentence landed heavily. Aaliyah looked up at him with a faint change in her expression, not surprise, but confirmation. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. That is a serious implication, she said. Ethan finally turned fully toward her. So is altering genetic identity data inside my own company. The words were quiet, but they changed the room. The executives around the table shifted subtly, no longer observers of a technical discussion, but participants in something that had moved beyond policy. Victoria exhaled slowly, then offered a faint smile. You are making a leap from incomplete evidence to a personal accusation. Aaliyah spoke again, her voice steady but soft. It is not incomplete. She reached into her backpack and removed a small folded printout, placing it on the table. Ethan looked down. It was a routing map, not of genetic data itself, but of how it had been moved through internal systems. One path stood out clearly, looping back through the same encrypted node repeatedly before final certification. Ethan traced it with his eyes. This is internal architecture, he said slowly. How did you access this level of mapping? Aaliyah hesitated. Because someone forgot I could see the maintenance feed from the observation terminal in the lower lab. Victoria's gaze flicked briefly toward Aaliyah, then away. Ethan noticed that shift. He did not comment on it, but he registered it. Slowly, he leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. Walk me through what you saw, he said to Aaliyah. She nodded once. The original genetic sequence was uploaded 3 days before final certification. At that point, it matched your intended family profile. Then, at 2:43 in the morning, it was duplicated into a shadow environment. That version was edited and returned as the official result. Ethan listened without interruption. Victoria stepped slightly forward again. Ethan, you are allowing her interpretation of technical logs to override established verification protocols. Ethan raised one hand again, stopping her. Let her finish. Aaliyah continued. After the edit, the system revalidated the altered version using a sealed certificate key that was not supposed to exist outside executive security. Ethan frowned. A certificate key? Aaliyah nodded. It was labeled under Emergency Continuity Authorization. A brief pause followed. Ethan slowly straightened. That authorization level is restricted to only 3 people in this building. Victoria's expression tightened just slightly. And those keys rotate under strict compliance schedules, she added quickly. Ethan looked at her now, fully, directly. Then explain why this key signature matches your access profile. The room seemed to contract again. Victoria did not respond immediately. For the first time, her composure showed a fracture, not visible in movement, but in timing. A delay that did not belong in certainty. That is not possible, she said finally. Ethan did not raise his voice. Then it should be easy to disprove. Aaliyah looked between them, her hands now resting still on the edge of the table. I did not want to say it like this, she said quietly. But the system did not just change data. It protected the change afterward. Ethan's voice lowered. Protected how? Aaliyah answered. By making the original version inaccessible even to you. A long silence followed. Ethan stepped back slightly, as if trying to understand not just the data, but the architecture of deception itself. Victoria's voice softened again, carefully measured. Ethan, you are standing in a room full of professionals who built the system you are questioning. You are being guided by a child's interpretation of complex infrastructure. Ethan looked at Aaliyah, then back at the screen. His voice, when it came, was quiet but final in tone. No, he said. I am being guided by what the system is showing when no one interferes with it. The room fell completely silent again, and for the first time, the distinction between truth and control inside Whitmore Genetics Tower stopped feeling theoretical. The silence that followed did not feel like an ending, but like a system waiting for the next instruction to determine what kind of reality would load first. Ethan Whitmore stood motionless for a brief moment longer, his eyes fixed on the unresolved patterns still glowing on the central display, as if staring long enough could force the structure beneath it to reveal its full shape. Around him, the executives remained frozen in uncertainty, their earlier confidence replaced by the instinct to wait for authority to re-establish itself. Dr. Victoria Hale finally broke the stillness by taking a slow step back from the table, her voice carefully controlled again. Ethan, I strongly advise that we pause all unauthorized analysis and return to standard review protocol before this situation escalates further. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he slowly reached forward and closed the audit interface on the main screen. The digital data vanished, leaving only the reflection of the room on the glass surface. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but more decisive. No further protocols, he said. Not until I know what is actually happening inside my own system. Aaliyah Johnson looked up at him, her expression steady but observant, as if she understood that something irreversible had just shifted. Victoria stepped closer again, her tone now more deliberate. Ethan, you are making a procedural decision under emotional influence. That is not how you run a corporation of this scale. Ethan finally turned toward her fully. Then explain to me why emotional influence appears in my system logs as unauthorized modification patterns, he said. The question landed without volume, but with precision. Victoria paused for half a second too long before responding. Because you are correlating unrelated variables, she said. That is what stress does to analytical judgment. Aaliyah stepped forward slightly. It is not stress, she said quietly. It is mapping. Ethan looked at her. Mapping to what? Aaliyah hesitated, then answered. To where the original data was moved after it was changed. The room shifted again, not physically, but in attention. Ethan moved away from the table, walking slowly toward the side console embedded in the wall. Show me the transfer pathway again, he said. The system responded instantly, projecting a simplified routing diagram across the glass panel. Lines appeared, connecting nodes across internal departments, but one section remained highlighted in a deeper shade of blue, pulsing faintly, as if resisting full exposure. Ethan studied it. This route bypasses executive visibility filters, he said. A senior engineer nodded reluctantly. It should not be possible for any active dataset to travel through that channel without triggering a containment alert. Victoria's voice cut in quickly. Unless it is an archived routing layer from legacy infrastructure. Ethan turned slightly toward her. Legacy infrastructure does not appear in live modification logs, he said. A brief silence followed. Aaliyah moved closer to the projection, pointing at the highlighted node. That is where it goes, she said. Every time it is corrected, it comes back through here first. Ethan narrowed his eyes. And where does it originate? Aaliyah looked up at him. From a restricted terminal on the upper genetic floor, she said. Victoria exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. That floor is under dual authorization security, she said. No single user can access it independently. Ethan looked at her directly. Yet someone did, he replied. He stepped back from the console and activated internal security protocols. The room lights shifted slightly, indicating a system-level access change. Lock down all genetic audit channels, he said. No external synchronization. No backup export. I want a closed system environment. The engineers hesitated for only a moment before complying. Soft confirmation tones echoed through the room. Victoria turned sharply. Ethan, you are isolating a live corporate environment without board authorization. Ethan did not look at her. The board can review it once I know what I am reviewing, he said. Aaliyah watched him closely. If you isolate it, she said softly, the hidden layer will still try to route through secondary access points. Ethan glanced at her. How do you know that? Aaliyah paused. Because I watched it happen 3 times before I came here. That sentence changed the tone in the room again. Ethan studied her carefully now, not as a witness, but as a source of structured observation. Then you stay with me, he said finally. Victoria's expression tightened. Ethan, You cannot bring a civilian child into secured containment space. Ethan turned slightly toward her. She is the only reason I am seeing any of this at all, he said. A brief silence followed. Then Ethan made a decision. We are moving to the primary data core, he said. If there is a hidden layer, it will not survive a full environment shift. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances, but complied. Security clearance permissions were revalidated. The glass conference room doors unlocked with a quiet mechanical sound. Ethan stepped forward first, and Aaliyah followed closely beside him. Victoria remained still for a moment longer, watching them leave, her expression no longer fully composed. As they exited into the corridor, the lighting changed from bright conference illumination to the cooler tone of restricted access pathways. The hallway was quieter, more controlled, every step echoing softly against polished surfaces. Aaliyah walked slightly ahead now, her attention focused, as if she recognized something in the environment that others did not. Ethan noticed this and slowed slightly. You have been here before, he said. Aaliyah nodded once. Not this room, she said. But I have seen the way the system feels when it is hiding something. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked ahead toward the sealed elevator leading to the core level. For the first time since entering the building that day, he was no longer simply reacting to information. He was following it. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime that felt too calm for what was happening above it. Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of the elevator car, his reflection faintly visible in the brushed metal walls, while the floor indicator began its slow descent toward the primary data core. Aaliyah Johnson stood slightly behind him, her small hands resting against the strap of her backpack, her gaze fixed upward as if she could already sense what awaited them before the doors opened. The enclosed space felt tighter with every passing floor, not because of physical size, but because of expectation building in silence. Ethan broke the quiet first. You said you have seen this kind of system behavior before, he said. Aaliyah nodded gently. Not exactly like this, she replied. But when systems are hiding something important, they feel heavier. Like they are trying not to be looked at directly. Ethan glanced at her through the reflection in the elevator wall. That is an unusual way to describe encrypted architecture. Aaliyah looked down for a moment, then back up. I do not know the technical words, she said. I just know what it feels like when something is not honest. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the descending floor numbers. One of the senior security engineers, standing near the elevator console, cleared his throat. We are entering restricted computational territory, he said carefully. If there is any active manipulation layer, it will become more detectable at this depth, but also more volatile in response behavior. Ethan nodded once. That is exactly why we are going there. The elevator slowed slightly, then stopped with a quiet mechanical signal. The doors slid open. The environment outside was different immediately, not visually chaotic, but structurally sterile, as if every surface had been designed to eliminate uncertainty. The lighting was cooler, more precise, and the air carried a faint hum of continuous processing. Systems running beneath the floor. Ethan stepped out first. Aaliyah followed closely. The corridor leading to the primary data core stretched ahead, lined with transparent panels showing streams of real-time genetic computation data flowing like rivers of light. Every panel displayed synchronized biological mapping sequences, constantly updating and recalibrating. Ethan slowed as he walked. This is the live core processing layer, he said. Aaliyah looked around quietly. It feels different, she said. It is less hidden here. Ethan glanced at her. That is because this layer is designed to be observable, he said. Anything hidden would not survive here. They reached a large circular access chamber where a central interface stood suspended in a ring of glass and fiber optic connections. As Ethan approached, the system recognized his authorization and activated immediately. A holographic interface expanded outward, projecting a full-scale visualization of genetic data flow across multiple synchronized nodes. Run integrity scan, Ethan ordered. The system responded instantly. Lines of data began to pulse, recalibrating across multiple dimensions. A progress indicator appeared, showing full system verification in real time. Aaliyah watched carefully. It will try to hide again, she said quietly. Ethan turned slightly toward her. If there is a hidden layer, this scan will isolate it. The system continued processing. For several seconds, everything appeared stable. Then, A subtle distortion appeared at the edge of the visualization. A faint duplication of data streams, almost imperceptible at first, began forming parallel to the primary output. Ethan noticed immediately. "Pause visualization layering," he said. The system complied. The main display froze. But the secondary stream did not disappear. Instead, it stabilized independently. A second version of the genetic data structure appeared beneath the original, slightly offset, running in parallel but not synchronized. Ethan stepped closer. "That should not exist," he said quietly. A senior engineer moved forward. "We are not detecting that layer in standard system logs," he said. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Because it is not part of standard logs," he replied. Aaliyah stepped forward slowly. "That is what I saw," she said. "It always runs underneath everything else." Ethan looked at her, then back at the duplicate stream. "Can it interact with the primary system?" he asked. The engineer hesitated. "It should not be able to," he said, "unless it was designed as a parallel override structure." Ethan's expression changed slightly at that phrase. "Show me its origin point," he said. The system traced the secondary stream backward. A thin line extended across the holographic map, moving through multiple secured nodes, bypassing standard checkpoints, until it reached a single origin terminal labeled under restricted access. Ethan stared at it. "That terminal is located in executive genetic authorization," he said slowly. Aaliyah looked up at him. "That is where it always starts," she said. Ethan turned slightly, scanning the full structure. "And then it merges back into certification after modification," he said. Aaliyah nodded. "Yes." A long silence followed. Ethan's voice lowered. "Run a full separation trace between primary and secondary outputs." The system began recalculating. Streams of data split apart visually, revealing how deeply the secondary layer had influenced final outputs across multiple certification cycles. Ethan watched without blinking. "This is not a single alteration," he said quietly. "It is a continuous parallel rewriting process." The engineer behind him spoke cautiously. "If that is true, then every certified result in the last cycle could have been influenced." Ethan did not respond immediately. His attention remained fixed on the cascading visualization. Aaliyah stepped closer again. "That is why I came," she said softly. Ethan looked down at her. "You were never supposed to see this," he said. Aaliyah shook her head slightly. "Someone had to." The system completed its trace. A final data node appeared, highlighting a repeated authorization signature embedded across multiple layers of modification. Ethan's expression tightened as he read it. He did not speak at first. Instead, he slowly stepped back from the interface. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of computational systems continuing to process unresolved anomalies. Ethan finally spoke, his voice controlled but heavier now. "This is not an error," he said. "This is architecture." Aaliyah looked up at him, waiting. Ethan turned his gaze toward the sealed corridor beyond the chamber, where executive authorization terminals were located. "And whoever built it," he said quietly, "designed it to stay invisible until now." The air inside the primary data core chamber felt different now, heavier in meaning rather than temperature, as if the building itself had begun responding to what had just been revealed. Ethan Whitmore stood in front of the suspended holographic interface, his eyes fixed on the stabilized secondary data stream that continued to exist even after full separation analysis. Aaliyah Johnson remained beside him, silent but attentive, her gaze moving between Ethan and the floating layers of genetic architecture that now felt less like data and more like evidence of intentional design. The senior engineer behind them spoke carefully. "We have never seen a parallel override structure persist after full isolation," he said. "If this is real, it means the system was built with a concealed governance layer." Ethan did not respond immediately. His focus remained on the repeated authorization signature embedded across multiple modification cycles. "This is not random interference," he said finally. "It is consistent control." Aaliyah looked up at him. "That is what I tried to tell you," she said quietly. Ethan turned slightly toward her. "You said you saw it before," he replied. "Where exactly did you first notice it behaving like this?" Aaliyah hesitated, then answered. "In the lower lab monitoring corridor," she said. "They were running a silent replication cycle after standard hours. The data looked normal on the surface, but underneath, it kept branching into a second version every time it was validated." Ethan's expression tightened slightly, and no one reported it. Aaliyah shook her head. Because the system logs never showed it. A brief silence followed. Ethan turned back to the interface. Expand authorization. Trace to executive origin layer, he said. The system responded instantly. The holographic display shifted again, pulling deeper into the infrastructure map. Layers of encrypted pathways unfolded, revealing a complex network of internal permissions cascading through multiple departments. At the center of it, a single node appeared repeatedly, highlighted across different time points. Ethan narrowed his eyes. That node is being reused across multiple independent certification cycles, he said. The engineer stepped forward. That should not be structurally possible, he confirmed. Ethan stepped closer to the display. Unless the system is designed to reuse it, he said. Aaliyah moved slightly closer as well. That is how it always felt, she said. Like it was following the same path, no matter what data went in. Ethan looked down at her. You understood pattern behavior without knowing the system, he said. Aaliyah nodded once. I just noticed what changed and what never changed. Ethan paused. That is the most accurate system analysis I have heard today, he said quietly. He turned back to the projection. Identify the owner of executive authorization, node 7 alpha, he ordered. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than normal before responding. A profile began to form, but parts of it remained intentionally obscured under layered encryption. Ethan noticed the delay. Why is that identity partially restricted? He asked. The engineer frowned. That level of restriction is not standard protocol, he said. It suggests active concealment within executive governance permissions. Victoria Hale, who had remained silent during the descent, finally spoke from behind them. Ethan, you are forcing the system to expose layers that were never intended for real-time interpretation, she said. Her voice was calm again, controlled in the way it had been earlier in the boardroom. There are structural safeguards for a reason. Ethan did not turn to her. Safeguards protect integrity, he said. They do not hide identity. Victoria stepped closer. You are assuming concealment implies wrongdoing, she said. Ethan finally turned. And you are assuming. Concealment does not, he replied. A long pause followed. The holographic interface continued to cycle quietly behind them, still holding the secondary stream in place like a shadow that refused to disappear. Aaliyah pointed again at the projection. That signature appears again there, she said. Ethan followed her gesture. Another modification cycle flashed across the timeline, and there it was again, the same authorization marker embedded in a different dataset, in a different year, but identical in structure. Ethan's voice lowered. This is not a single event, he said. This is a system-wide continuity pattern. The engineer looked uneasy. If that is the case, he said slowly, then the genetic certification framework itself may have been operating under dual logic states. Ethan stepped back slightly. Primary and secondary truth layers, he said. Aaliyah looked at him. That is what I meant when I said it always felt like there were two versions of everything, she said. Victoria's expression shifted subtly. Ethan, she said again, softer now. You are standing inside a system that processes millions of genetic records. Anomalies will always appear when you isolate data at this level. Ethan finally looked directly at her. Then explain why every anomaly leads back to the same authorization origin, he said. Silence filled the chamber again. The holographic display continued its quiet motion, revealing deeper correlations as if responding to the attention it was finally receiving. Ethan turned back toward the system. Run historical correlation across all executive authorization nodes for the last 10 years, he ordered. The system complied. Lines extended outward, connecting cycles across time, and for the first time, the structure of repetition became undeniable. Ethan watched without speaking. Aaliyah stood beside him, her small presence steady in contrast to the expanding complexity around them. After a moment, Ethan exhaled slowly. This is not just about one result, he said quietly. This is about every result that was ever certified under this system. The chamber remained silent as the implications settled fully, not as theory, but as confirmed. Structural reality. And somewhere deep within the layered architecture still running beneath them, the same authorization pattern continued to exist without interruption. The expansion of the historical correlation map filled the holographic chamber with a slow, almost rhythmic pulse of light, as if the system itself was trying to breathe through the weight of its own exposure. Ethan Whitmore stood motionless in front of it, his eyes scanning layer after layer of interconnected authorization cycles stretching back across years of genetic certification records. What had begun as a single anomaly had now unfolded into a continuous structural pattern that refused to break, no matter how deeply it was isolated or filtered. Aaliyah Johnson remained close by, her attention focused on the same projections, but her gaze occasionally shifted to Ethan, as if measuring how much of the truth he was ready to carry at once. The senior engineer spoke quietly from behind them. "We are no longer looking at a single system breach," he said. "This is distributed across multiple certification generations." Ethan nodded slightly, his voice calm but weighted. "It is a framework," he said, "not a mistake." Victoria Hale stood slightly apart from the group, her posture still composed, but her silence had become more deliberate, as if she was choosing not to interrupt rather than unable to respond. Ethan raised his hand toward the interface. "Isolate the earliest instance of authorization, node 7 alpha, he ordered. The system responded, and the holographic projection shifted again, pulling the timeline backward into earlier development phases of the genetic certification infrastructure. The display slowed as it reached foundational architecture layers, where initial system design decisions were encoded. A faint pulse highlighted a single origin point. Ethan stepped closer. "There," he said quietly. Aaliyah leaned in slightly. "That is where it begins," she said. Ethan studied the projection carefully. The node was not just a point of access, but a repeated structural anchor embedded into multiple independent systems. "This was not added later," he said. "It was part of the original design." The engineer frowned. "That would imply intentional inclusion of a parallel control mechanism at the architectural level," he said. Ethan did not look away from the display. "Yes," he said simply. A long silence followed as the implications settled into the room. Victoria finally spoke, her tone measured. "Even if that is true, Ethan, architectural intent does not automatically imply misuse. Systems evolve. Permissions change over time." Ethan turned slightly toward her. "But this one did not evolve," he said. "It replicated." He gestured toward the projection. "Every modification cycle we have seen leads back to the same structural origin point. That is not evolution. That is repetition." Aaliyah looked up at him. "It always goes back to the same place," she said quietly. "No matter how many times it changes on the surface." Ethan nodded once. "That is why it was never detected," he said. "Because every verification layer was built on top of the same hidden foundation." The holographic interface shifted again, revealing a deeper layer beneath the origin node. This layer was not labeled in standard terminology. Instead, it was marked with a neutral system tag indicating foundational governance override. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "That layer should not be accessible from any user level," he said. The engineer stepped forward, visibly uneasy now. "It is not accessible," he said. "It should not even be rendered in visualization protocols." Ethan studied it closely. "And yet here it is," he said. Aaliyah pointed gently at a repeating sequence within the structure. "That pattern is what I saw before," she said. "It always activates when data is being finalized." Ethan looked at her. "Activates how?" Aaliyah hesitated, then answered. "It replaces the final confirmation step with a mirrored version that looks identical but carries different authorization weight." Ethan's expression tightened slightly. "So the system is not rejecting truth," he said. "It is replacing it before it can be confirmed." Victoria's voice broke the silence again. "You are interpreting system redundancy as intentional deception," she said. Ethan turned toward her fully now. "No," he replied. "I am observing repeated substitution under identical conditions." The room fell silent again. The holographic projection continued to rotate slowly, revealing the full depth of the genetic certification architecture as it now appeared less like a tool and more like a controlled environment with layered visibility constraints. Ethan stepped back slightly. "Run a comparative overlay between certified outputs and raw input sequences across all affected cycles," he ordered. The system complied instantly. Two layers appeared side by side, one labeled raw input and the other labeled certified output. As they aligned, discrepancies became visible not in random distribution, but in consistent directional adjustment. Ethan watched carefully. "Every deviation moves toward a single convergence point," he said. The engineer nodded slowly. That would suggest guided optimization rather than random error correction. Aaliyah looked at Ethan. That is what I meant before, she said. It always knows where it is supposed to end. Ethan did not respond immediately. His focus remained on the alignment of both data layers as they continued to converge at the same structural endpoint regardless of input variation. After a long pause, he spoke quietly. This system does not generate results, he said. It enforces them. The words settled into the chamber with finality. Victoria remained silent, her expression unreadable now, as the full scale of the architecture continued to reveal itself layer by layer in the suspended holographic space. And at the center of it all, the repeated authorization signature continued to pulse, unchanged, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment to be seen. The holographic chamber remained suspended in a state of controlled stillness, as if the entire system had reached a point where further concealment was no longer possible without breaking its own internal logic. Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of the projection field, his eyes reflecting the layered genetic architecture that now stretched across multiple generations of data, each one converging toward the same unresolved origin. Aaliyah Johnson stood slightly to his right, quiet but steady, her presence no longer uncertain but grounded, as if she had already accepted the shape of what was being revealed long before anyone else could fully see it. Dr. Victoria Hale remained near the outer edge of the chamber, her posture still composed, but the distance between her and the others now felt less physical and more structural, as if she had stepped outside the shared understanding forming in the room. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but sharpened by clarity rather than confusion. Run final consolidation trace across all certified outputs linked to node 7 alpha, he said. The system responded immediately, and the holographic layers shifted once again, compressing years of genetic certification data into a single unified visualization. What appeared this time was not separate streams or fragmented anomalies, but a continuous chain of aligned outputs, all converging through the same hidden pathway before reaching final validation. Aaliyah stepped slightly closer to the projection, her eyes following the convergence point. It always ends in the same place, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Because every decision point is being guided back into a predefined endpoint, he replied. The engineer behind them spoke cautiously, his voice carrying the weight of professional disbelief. If this is accurate, then the system is not correcting outcomes after processing, he said. It is steering outcomes before final evaluation even begins. Ethan did not look away from the display. That would mean certification is not verification, he said. It is confirmation of a result that has already been selected. A long silence followed. The holographic structure continued to pulse softly, revealing layers that now looked less like data and more like intention embedded in architecture. Aaliyah turned slightly toward Ethan. That is why I kept saying it felt like there were two versions, she said. One that everyone sees, and one that actually decides. Ethan looked down at her. You were describing system bifurcation without knowing the terminology, he said. But your observation was correct. Victoria finally stepped forward into the light of the projection, her voice steady but no longer carrying the same controlled confidence it had earlier. Ethan, even if a layered decision structure exists, that does not automatically imply manipulation of genetic identity, she said. You are interpreting alignment as intent. Ethan turned toward her fully now. No, he said. I am observing consistent outcome direction across independent inputs that should not converge unless influenced. He paused briefly, then added, that is not interpretation. That is pattern validation. Aaliyah looked between them, then back at the projection. It is not just guiding results, she said softly. It is deciding who gets included in them. The words hung in the chamber with a weight that seemed to slow even the ambient system hum. Ethan's gaze returned to the central convergence point. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped closer to the interface and initiated a deep origin extraction sequence. The system responded with a subtle shift in tone, and the projection reorganized into a single vertical pathway extending downward through multiple invisible layers of infrastructure. At the very base of the structure, beneath all certification layers, beneath all validation protocols, there appeared a final node that had not been visible in any previous scan. Ethan narrowed his eyes. That node is not part of any documented system architecture, he said quietly. The engineer shook his head slowly. It should not exist, he confirmed. Aaliyah stepped closer to Ethan again, her voice barely above a whisper. That is where they decide before anything else happens, she said. Ethan looked at her. Who are they, he asked. Aaliyah hesitated for the first time since this process began, her gaze fixed on the lowest point of the projection. The ones who never appear in the final report, she said. Victoria's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before she regained composure. Ethan, she said carefully, you are standing inside a system designed for precision medicine at global scale. What you are describing would require coordinated governance beyond any single institution. Ethan turned slightly toward her. Then explain why every pathway leads to the same hidden decision layer, he said. The chamber remained silent again. The holographic projection continued its slow rotation, now fully exposing the dual structure of the system, one visible and certified, the other concealed but consistently active beneath it. Ethan stepped back slightly, absorbing the full scale of what had been revealed. This is not an error condition, he said quietly. This is controlled reality shaping. Aaliyah looked up at him, her voice calm but certain. And it has been doing it long before today, she said. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the lowest hidden node, now fully visible in the projection, pulsing with a steady rhythm that matched none of the visible system cycles above it. And in that moment, the structure of everything they believed about truth, certification, and identity stood fully exposed, no longer as assumption or anomaly, but as architecture waiting for recognition.